Secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them. Sometimes, they come in whispers, hidden in the corners of old houses, waiting for the right moment to shatter the past. Other times, they explode like a storm, leaving destruction in their wake. In this story, the truth has been buried for decades, locked behind the walls of a home filled with love, lies, and an unbearable secret. What happens when a devoted husband, who has spent 60 years by his wife's side, uncovers something that changes everything he ever knew about their life together? Get ready for an emotional roller coaster of love, betrayal, and a truth that was never meant to be found. If you enjoy gripping, heart-wrenching stories, don't forget to subscribe and follow for more. Now let's begin. Isabella Wright had always been the epitome of control, a force of nature in Manhattan's dazzling elite. Every detail of her life was meticulously managed, from the gleam of her custom-designed shoes to the carefully curated guest lists at her opulent soirees. As the CEO of a vast business empire and the heir to a storied family legacy, she moved through life with a quiet authority that left no room for unpredictability. Her world was one of unyielding order, precision, and luxury, a fortress built on wealth and the assurance of absolute control. That certainty was put to the test one crisp autumn evening at an exclusive gala held in one of Manhattan's most luxurious ballrooms. The event glittered with opulence, crystal chandeliers, the murmur of polite conversation, and the scent of rare perfumes mingling in the air. Isabella, resplendent in a tailored gown and radiant with confidence, navigated the crowd with the ease of a seasoned conductor leading a symphony. But amidst the accolades and whispered admiration, a challenge emerged from an unexpected source: her own brother, Alexander. Alexander was known as much for his mischievous spirit as for his penchant for stirring up trouble. With a rakish smile and eyes that twinkled with irreverence, he stepped forward, drawing a small, curious crowd around him. In a voice that carried both jest and seriousness, he proposed a wager that would shatter Isabella's immaculate world. "Why not test the limits of your perfect existence?" he teased, his tone laced with playful provocation. "Step outside your gilded cage and marry a man from the other side of life for 6 months. Win the bet, and you gain sole control over the family empire. Lose, and you must admit that control isn't everything." The room fell silent as Alexander's words hung in the air. Isabella's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the thrill of a challenge that resonated with the deepest parts of her competitive spirit. Here was an opportunity to prove that she could conquer even the wildest, most unpredictable aspects of life. The stakes were astronomical, not only in terms of power and wealth, but in the fundamental assertion of her identity. Accepting meant exposing herself to vulnerability, to a world far removed from the meticulous order she had built around herself. In that moment, Isabella's mind whirled with calculated possibilities. She could dismiss the challenge as a mere parlor game among family, or she could engage it head-on, testing her adaptability and resilience. The thought of deliberately choosing a life so foreign to her own ignited a spark, an irresistible urge to confront and subvert the very essence of her existence. With a decisive nod that belied her inner tempest, she accepted the bet. The terms were clear: a 6-month marriage to someone entirely outside her sphere, an arrangement devoid of traditional romance or sentiment, but charged with the potential to upend everything she believed about herself. As the echoes of Alexander's challenge faded into the background, Isabella retreated into the quiet confidence of her inner sanctum. In that solitude, the enormity of the wager began to crystallize in her mind. She would need to find a partner who was not only a stark contrast to her polished, high-society life, but someone unpredictable enough to unsettle the rigid boundaries she had long enforced. The challenge was no longer about proving her superiority. It was about exploring uncharted territories of the heart and mind. That night, as Isabella gazed out at the city's luminous skyline, she felt a curious mix of excitement and apprehension. The familiar world of wealth and control was about to be invaded by something raw, genuine, and utterly unpredictable. The bet had been cast, and with it, the promise of a transformation that could redefine who she was at her core. The morning after the gala, Manhattan awoke to its usual rhythm: busy streets, relentless ambition, and the gleam of possibility. Yet for Isabella Wright, the day carried a singular purpose. Still buzzing from the adrenaline of the previous evening, she convened an urgent meeting with her most trusted assistant, Sophia. In the minimalist elegance of her high-rise office, Isabella laid out the challenge in stark terms. She needed to find a man who was the polar opposite of everything she embodied. Sophia, who had spent years navigating the labyrinth of high society and corporate intrigue, listened intently. Isabella's request was as clear as it was unconventional. Compile a list of candidates who existed far outside the refined echelons of Manhattan's elite. She wasn't interested in the polished, predictable men of her world, bankers, financiers, or rising executives. Instead, she demanded a candidate from the fringes. Cab drivers with stories etched into their weathered faces, struggling artists who saw beauty in imperfection, mechanics whose calloused hands spoke of labor and authenticity. Sophia, ever resourceful, set to work immediately. Yet as the day unfolded, Isabella found herself increasingly unsatisfied with the roster of names presented to her. Each candidate, though undoubtedly genuine, lacked the spark of unpredictability she craved, a certain rugged charm, a spirit that would defy the conventional expectations of her gilded lifestyle. They were admirable in their own right, yet too predictable, too easy to influence with her typical blend of subtle persuasion and commanding presence. Just as Isabella began to question the viability of the wager, a name surfaced that made her pulse quicken, a name that did not belong on any list of the elite. James Carter. His reputation preceded him, a broad-shouldered, rugged mechanic known not only for his skill with engines, but also for his unwavering commitment to a cause greater than himself. In his spare time, James volunteered at a local homeless shelter, a world away from the marble halls and polished banquets Isabella was accustomed to. His life was a tapestry of raw determination, genuine compassion, and an unyielding independence that both intrigued and challenged her. Isabella reviewed every detail she could find about James. Photographs revealed a man whose face bore the marks of hard work and weathered resilience. Stories circulated of his self-sufficiency and his refusal to be swayed by the trappings of wealth. Unlike the men she knew, James had no interest in climbing the corporate ladder or indulging in the excesses of high society. His heart lay with those less fortunate, and his life was guided by a steadfast moral compass rather than the lure of power or prestige. The more Isabella learned, the more she recognized that James embodied the antithesis of her controlled existence. Here was a man who lived with raw authenticity, a man who could neither be tamed nor manipulated by the subtle machinations of influence that Isabella wielded so effortlessly. His very nature presented the ultimate challenge, to navigate the unpredictable terrain of genuine passion, unfiltered emotions, and a life built on the principles of integrity rather than artifice. With a sense of purpose rekindled, Isabella resolved that James Carter would be her candidate. This was not a mere test of adaptability. It was a journey into the unknown realms of vulnerability and transformation. The stakes were higher than ever. By choosing a partner from an entirely different world, Isabella risked exposing the very core of her meticulously constructed identity. As the day gave way to a dusky twilight over the city, Isabella felt an unfamiliar mix of anticipation and trepidation. The first step of her journey had been taken, not merely a bet on a man, but a wager on her ability to evolve. With the decision made, she prepared to enter the next phase of a challenge that promised to unravel everything she thought she knew about control, love, and the essence of life itself. Later that week, under a sky the color of steel at dawn, Isabella made her way to an unassuming neighborhood far removed from the towering glass and marble structures of her usual haunts. The destination was a modest auto repair garage, a realm where grease, grit, and honest labor reigned supreme. As she crossed the threshold, the sharp scent of oil and metal filled her senses, a stark contrast to the perfumed halls of her world. There, in the midst of scattered tools and humming machinery, stood James Carter, a figure as unrefined as he was resolute. Isabella's entrance was as calculated as ever. Dressed in an outfit that married understated elegance with an unmistakable air of authority, she moved toward James with an assurance that brooked no opposition. His eyes, dark and searching, met hers with an unspoken question. He wiped his hands on a rag, pausing his work on a stubborn engine, and eyed the unexpected visitor with a mix of curiosity and caution. "What brings a woman like you to a place like this?" James asked, his tone laced with skepticism and a hint of amusement. The question, blunt yet sincere, hung between them as Isabella regarded him with a measured smile. Without missing a beat, she launched into the proposal that would change both of their lives. "James Carter, I have a challenge for you. A bet, if you will. I propose a 6-month marriage, a transaction of sorts. No emotional entanglements, just a structured arrangement. In return, you will receive compensation that you can direct to support your work at the shelter, and perhaps a few luxuries along the way." Her voice was cool, even, yet beneath the surface there flickered an intensity that promised transformation. James raised an eyebrow. The idea was as absurd as it was intriguing. A 6-month marriage? With me? A man who fixes cars and lives for the community? What exactly do you expect to gain from this? His words were blunt, carrying the weight of someone unaccustomed to the lofty machinations of wealth. Isabella's eyes sparkled with a mixture of challenge and sincerity. "Control," she replied simply. "I want to see if I can adapt, to break free from my scripted existence. And I want to see if you can live by your ideals in a world that doesn't understand them." Her tone was not one of condescension, but of a deep-seated determination to test the limits of both their worlds. For a long moment, silence reigned in the cluttered space of the garage. Tools clattered softly in the background as James considered the proposition. His gaze shifted from Isabella's unyielding expression to the worn, honest lines etched on his face. Though money was of little interest to him, the thought of channeling support to the shelter, the place that embodied everything he stood for, resonated deeply. Finally, with a slow nod that carried both acceptance and a hint of defiance, James spoke. "I'll do it. Not for you, but for them. The people who need me, and maybe for a chance to see what I'm really capable of outside of what's expected." His voice, though steady, betrayed an undercurrent of vulnerability, a willingness to step into a world where rules were written in an entirely different language. In that moment, the terms of their unusual arrangement were sealed with an unspoken understanding. Isabella's heart, which had long been encased in ice and precision, throbbed with the possibility of change. And James, with every calloused hand and weary smile, braced himself for a journey that would challenge his convictions and force him to question the boundaries of his simple, yet noble, existence. Thus began a bet that was as much a test of will as it was an exploration of identity, a bet that would inevitably blur the lines between a transaction and something far more profound. When the evening arrived that James Carter was to step into the luminous, meticulously arranged world of Isabella Wright, he did so with the guarded anticipation of a man venturing into alien territory. Isabella's penthouse was perched high above the city, a modern palace of glass, steel, and unfaltering precision. As James followed her through a series of elegantly austere corridors, each step echoed with the silent promise of a life completely foreign to him. The interior was a masterclass in refined minimalism. Polished marble floors, custom art installations, and an ambient light that softly bathed every surface in cool hues greeted him at every turn. Even the silence seemed orchestrated, an unspoken directive for decorum and restraint. For Isabella, this was home, a sanctuary where every detail was controlled, every element accounted for. For James, it was a dazzling yet confining world of order and opulence. Isabella wasted no time in laying down the rules of engagement. In a sitting room that overlooked the sprawling urban expanse, she explained the parameters of their arrangement with clinical precision. "James," she began, her voice firm yet not unkind, "this is not a relationship in the traditional sense. It is a transaction, a mutual agreement where you will integrate into my world for 6 months. You are expected to attend social events, adhere to a dress code that befits these gatherings, and above all, maintain a standard that reflects well on us both." Her words carried the weight of a contract, each clause meticulously chosen. James listened intently, his eyes scanning the room and the woman before him. The rules seemed as rigid as the architecture around them, and yet he detected in Isabella's tone an underlying vulnerability, a hint that even this fortress of wealth and precision might be masking something deeper. With a wry smile that spoke of both skepticism and a spark of amusement, he replied. So, this isn't about romance or companionship. It's all business. His voice was measured, the question both a challenge and a plea for clarity. Precisely, she said. Our arrangement is designed to test our limits, to see if we can function in each other's worlds without the interference of conventional emotions. There was an edge to her words, a silent admission that beneath the veneer of transaction lay the possibility of something unexpected. James's reply was equally measured as he returned her smile with a hint of defiance. Then let's hope I'm worth the investment, he quipped, the corners of his mouth lifting in a half-smirk. In that exchange, the unspoken understanding was clear. They were both embarking on a journey that might, despite their careful declarations, stir emotions and blur the lines between obligation and genuine connection. As the night deepened and the city lights sparkled far below, James settled into the penthouse, a world of sterile perfection that contrasted starkly with the warm, chaotic pulse of his everyday life. The apartment was filled with the echoes of a life lived by rules, every moment choreographed to perfection. Yet as he lay on the edge of an impossibly soft sofa, he couldn't help but feel that within the confines of Isabella's controlled realm, there lay the potential for something transformative, even if it meant sacrificing the raw authenticity of his own world. For Isabella, watching James adjust to his surroundings was both a triumph and a quiet source of trepidation. Here was a man who defied the neatly drawn boundaries of her existence, an unpredictable variable in a formula she had always trusted to remain constant. As the clock ticked past midnight, each of them stood on the threshold of a journey that promised to upend not only their daily routines, but their very understanding of what it meant to live, to feel, and to truly be free. In the days that followed, the collision of two distinct worlds became inevitable. Life within Isabella's meticulously orchestrated existence was akin to a finely rehearsed play, each social engagement a performance, every interaction governed by unspoken rules and predetermined protocols. For Isabella, this world was a sanctuary of precision. For James, it was a confining stage where authenticity was stifled by expectations. At lavish cocktail parties in opulent ballrooms and intimate dinners in private dining rooms adorned with priceless art, Isabella moved with the grace and poise of a seasoned socialite. Yet as she glided from one event to the next, she found herself increasingly perturbed by the rigidity that defined her life. Every conversation was scripted, every gesture a calculated move in a game of appearances. And in the midst of this perfectly curated spectacle, James was an anomaly, a man who refused to conform to the unyielding demands of her world. James's approach was a study in delightful rebellion. At a formal dinner held in a palatial estate, while others sipped champagne and exchanged pleasantries, he casually excused himself from the table to prepare a hearty, greasy breakfast in the immaculate kitchen. The aroma of sizzling bacon and eggs, so out of place amid the refined flavors of gourmet cuisine, provoked stares from the impeccably dressed guests. Yet James's actions were not born of defiance for its own sake. They were a reminder of a life lived on honest terms, unburdened by the pretensions of wealth. Frustration bubbled within Isabella as she watched him disregard the finely honed etiquette that had defined her existence. You can't just shove your world into mine and expect everything to work out, she admonished one evening, her tone a mixture of exasperation and disbelief. You're making it difficult to maintain the standards that I've spent my entire life cultivating. Her words, sharp and precise, echoed off the polished surfaces of the dining hall, a stark contrast to the warmth and spontaneity that James embodied. James, unruffled by her rebuke, simply met her gaze with quiet determination. Maybe your world isn't the only one that matters, he replied softly, a trace of defiance mingled with sincerity in his tone. In that moment, as their worlds collided, both realized that the rigid boundaries they had erected were beginning to crumble. Isabella, for all her control, felt a stir of doubt, a questioning of whether the perfection she had so carefully constructed was truly worth the price it demanded. Over the ensuing weeks, the tension between their two lives grew more pronounced. Social events, once arenas of effortless elegance, became battlegrounds of clashing ideals. While Isabella struggled to maintain her composure amid the chaos of James's unorthodox behavior, He found solace in the simplicity of his own values, values that celebrated imperfection and authenticity over the sterile artifice of high society. As the friction between them intensified, Isabella began to question the very foundation of her existence. Could a world built on rigid control coexist with the unpredictable, raw pulse of real life? And was it possible that in challenging the carefully scripted narrative of her life, she might discover a truth that lay hidden beneath the layers of wealth and propriety? The answer, elusive yet tantalizing, hung in the balance as both Isabella and James grappled with the inevitable collision of their two very different worlds. One crisp Saturday morning, as the city's pulse began its relentless beat, James extended an invitation that would irrevocably alter the course of their uneasy arrangement. "Isabella," he said gently over a steaming cup of black coffee in the quiet of the penthouse kitchen, "if you truly wish to understand what drives me, you must see my world." His words, soft yet insistent, carried the weight of a challenge, a plea for her to step beyond the gilded cage of her upbringing and experience life in its rawest form. For Isabella, the request was as disarming as it was disconcerting. Her life had always been a carefully choreographed dance of precision and control. Yet now, faced with the prospect of immersing herself in a realm where chaos and unpredictability reigned, she felt a spark of curiosity that she could no longer ignore. Reluctantly, she agreed to accompany James to the local homeless shelter, a place far removed from the sanitized, predictable elegance of her world. The shelter was a study in contrasts. Gone were the polished surfaces and understated luxury. Instead, the space was alive with the hum of genuine activity, the warmth of unguarded humanity, and a tangible sense of urgency that pulsed through every room. As Isabella stepped inside, her senses were overwhelmed by sights and sounds that had long been foreign to her. Children's laughter mingled with the soft murmur of volunteers, and the air carried the bittersweet scent of hope tempered by hardship. James guided her through the shelter with a quiet pride, introducing her to individuals whose lives were marked by resilience and fortitude. In one small corner, Isabella observed a single mother cradling her child, a picture of raw determination in the face of overwhelming adversity. James moved among them with ease, offering help, comfort, and a compassionate smile to each person he encountered. The effortless kindness in his every gesture was a stark counterpoint to the impersonal transactions that defined Isabella's own existence. As the day unfolded, Isabella found herself increasingly drawn into the rhythm of this unfiltered world. Here, there were no scripted conversations or enforced formalities, only the honest, unvarnished reality of human life in its most vulnerable state. She began to see the shelter not merely as a place of charity, but as a vibrant community where every small act of kindness held the power to transform lives. By the time evening fell and the shelter quieted into a gentle lull, Isabella's heart was heavy with new insights. The genuine gratitude in the eyes of those she had met, the soft thank yous, the hopeful smiles, etched themselves into her memory. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of doubt about the sanctity of the world she had built. The rigid boundaries and cold precision that had once defined her seemed inadequate in the face of such raw, unfiltered humanity. That night, as Isabella lay awake in the silence of her penthouse, she wrestled with a profound inner conflict. The visit to the shelter had ignited a spark of empathy and introspection that threatened to upend everything she had known. Doubt, long suppressed beneath layers of control and pride, crept into her thoughts like a quiet whisper. Could the perfection of her world truly be the measure of success? Or was there something far more valuable hidden in the messy, unpredictable tapestry of life? In the stillness of the early hours, Isabella realized that her journey was only beginning. The bet was no longer just a challenge to her ability to control. It was an invitation to discover a deeper truth about herself, one that lay waiting in the uncharted territory of a world she had never truly known. Isabella awoke the morning after a restless night with a heavy, persistent echo of James's words resonating in her mind. Maybe your world isn't the only one that matters. Those simple words, spoken with quiet conviction in the midst of a chaotic dinner party, had ignited a storm inside her, a storm that threatened to shatter the perfectly constructed veneer of control she had maintained for so long. At first, Isabella tried to dismiss the stirring doubt as nothing more than a temporary lapse, a fleeting moment of vulnerability in an otherwise impervious fortress of wealth and precision. Yet as days passed, subtle fissures began to appear in her carefully curated reality. In the pristine corridors of her penthouse, every reflection in a mirror, every meticulously arranged piece of art, now seemed to whisper a question. Is this all there is? Determined to understand the root of these unsettling thoughts, Isabella found herself returning to the homeless shelter, a place she had only visited under James's insistence. This time, she arrived alone, unaccompanied by the trappings of her high society persona. In the shelter's bustling yet humble environment, the layers of her defense started to crumble. The laughter of children, the earnest smiles of volunteers, and the quiet resilience of those struggling to rebuild their lives formed a tapestry of raw humanity that was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while distributing donated clothes and assisting with meal preparations, Isabella experienced an unexpected moment of connection. A middle-aged volunteer named Mara, with kind eyes that had seen both hardship and hope, struck up a conversation with her. "You have a gentle way about you," Mara observed, not unkindly, as she folded blankets with careful precision. "I can tell you carry a lot of weight inside. Sometimes it helps to let it go." Isabella paused, the weight of those words sinking in. In the midst of the volunteer work, so far removed from the sterile opulence of her former life, she began to see the stark contrast between a life dictated by rigid rules and one nurtured by genuine care. Every genuine thank you, every smile of gratitude, chipped away at the facade she had built over the years. The relentless pursuit of perfection, the unyielding need for control, now seemed less like a mark of strength and more like a barrier to true connection. That evening, after returning to her penthouse, Isabella sat alone in her dimly lit study. The city's shimmering lights outside appeared distant, almost inconsequential. Instead of focusing on the next business decision or the upcoming social engagement, she revisited memories of the shelter, the raw sincerity of the people, the unfiltered joy, and the pain they carried. With each recollection, her meticulously maintained armor felt increasingly fragile. Her thoughts churned in a silent monologue of self-inquiry. Had she always been the woman who orchestrated life from a distance? Or was there a hidden part of her yearning to experience the unrefined, unscripted moments that defined true humanity? The more he pondered, the more she realized that the flawless image she projected was nothing more than a delicate construct, one that could shatter under the weight of genuine emotion. By the end of that week, Isabella noticed subtle changes in her behavior. In board meetings, her remarks became less curt, more reflective. At social gatherings, she allowed herself fleeting moments of vulnerability, a sincere smile here, a thoughtful pause there. James, ever watchful, began to notice that the woman he had once seen as an unyielding force was now displaying a softness that was both surprising and disarming. The metamorphosis wasn't dramatic, a gradual thawing rather than an abrupt collapse, but it was enough to spark an inner revolution. For the first time in years, Isabella started to question the worth of her meticulously built world. The facade of control was unraveling, thread by delicate thread, as the undeniable allure of authenticity beckoned her to step beyond her self-imposed limits. As she lay awake that night, Isabella wondered if the path to true strength lay not in the unyielding pursuit of perfection, but in the courage to embrace imperfection, vulnerability, and connection. And though the journey ahead promised uncertainty, the slow disintegration of her old self felt like the necessary beginning of something profoundly real. In the weeks that followed, the fragile wall between Isabella's two worlds began to dissolve. With each passing day, the moments she spent in the shelter and the quiet, unexpected interactions with James wove a delicate tapestry of connection that neither could have foreseen. The cold distance of their initial arrangement slowly thawed, replaced by tentative moments of genuine laughter and shared secrets. During one particular evening, while Isabella and James attended a modest charity event for the shelter, a rare moment of levity broke through the formal veneer. As they mingled with guests, Isabella caught herself laughing, a sound that felt strangely foreign in the context of her usual measured tones. Beside her, James's eyes crinkled with warmth, and for the first time, their conversation moved beyond the rigid boundaries of the bet. They spoke of childhood memories, of dreams unfulfilled, and of moments when life had surprised them in unexpected ways. Between the clink of glasses and soft background music, Isabella discovered that James possessed a depth of insight that belied his unassuming exterior. He recounted tales of nights spent repairing broken-down engines under a starlit sky, and the simple yet profound joy of connecting with people who had nothing but hope. In turn, Isabella shared fragments of her own guarded past, a life of privilege tempered by an ever-present loneliness, a relentless pursuit of perfection that left little room for vulnerability. Their growing connection was not marked by grand declarations or overwhelming passion, but by the quiet assurance that each was beginning to see the world and themselves through a more compassionate lens. Outside the gilded cage of her former life, Isabella found herself daring to question everything she had taken for granted. The stark, unfiltered reality of the shelter had not only exposed her to life's raw beauty, but had also kindled a spark of empathy that was slowly transforming her from the inside out. Yet, amid this burgeoning closeness, the shadow of the bet loomed large, a constant, unspoken reminder of the wager that had brought them together in the first place. Isabella's internal conflict grew more acute with every smile they shared and every silent glance that spoke of unacknowledged feelings. Was it possible that in this carefully orchestrated challenge, she had found something real? And if so, how could she reconcile the genuine warmth blossoming between them with the cold calculus of their original agreement? James, too, wrestled with his own doubts. In the quiet moments after their shared laughter, he found himself questioning whether his heart was ready to risk vulnerability. The stakes of their arrangement, initially set as a challenge of wills, had evolved into something far more intricate, a subtle dance between duty and desire, between a contract and an unspoken promise of something deeper. His practical nature, so firmly rooted in a life of honest labor and self-reliance, now found itself at odds with an emerging longing for connection. One late autumn evening, as rain softly drummed against the penthouse's large windows, Isabella and James found themselves alone in the quiet of her study. The silence was comfortable, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of the changes taking place between them. Isabella's gaze met James's, and for a moment, the formalities of their arrangement melted away, leaving behind only the raw vulnerability of two souls on the cusp of transformation. In that gentle, rain-soaked pause, Isabella felt the weight of her former life, the endless pursuit of control and perfection, begin to lift. She realized that the beauty of their growing connection lay in its unpredictability, its capacity to challenge every preconceived notion of who she was supposed to be. And as James's hand reached out to hers, tentative yet sincere, the silent promise of a shared future shimmered between them, a promise that neither the bet nor the rigid constructs of their past could ever fully extinguish. One cool evening, as the city's pulse softened into a quiet lull, a knock at the penthouse door shattered the fragile harmony that had settled between Isabella and James. The unexpected visitor, a close friend from one of Isabella's high society circles, stepped in, clutching a sleek tablet with an expression of troubled curiosity. With a hesitant glance at Isabella, the friend explained that he had stumbled upon an online article that detailed an unusual bet, a wager between a billionaire heiress and a rugged mechanic that was making quiet waves in the tabloids. Isabella's heart clenched as she realized that the carefully concealed truth was now exposed in the harsh light of public scrutiny. The article, replete with salacious details and speculative commentary, painted their arrangement not as a journey of mutual discovery, but as a calculated game of power and control. Her eyes darted toward James, whose expression had turned from relaxed amusement to guarded disbelief. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions and unresolved pain. James rose slowly from the plush sofa, the tablet still in his friend's trembling hands. His voice, usually calm and measured, now trembled with barely restrained anger and hurt. "Is this what we've been? What this is, nothing more than a bet?" he asked, his tone laced with betrayal. His words reverberated through the room, each syllable slicing through the fragile intimacy they had built over the past weeks. Isabella's mind raced as she struggled to reconcile the public revelation with the private moments of vulnerability they had shared. The weight of the bet, a challenge that had initially been nothing more than a test of will, had become a looming specter, threatening to unravel the delicate connection they had nurtured. In that moment, every laugh, every tender exchange, every whispered hope seemed tainted by deception. Desperation and regret warred within her. How could she explain that what had begun as a calculated wager had unexpectedly evolved into something genuine, something that made her question every long-held belief about herself? She reached out, her voice soft and imploring. "James, please, let me explain." But the damage was done. The article, with its invasive scrutiny and unyielding focus on the bet, had shattered the carefully constructed illusion of their arrangement. James's eyes, once filled with cautious warmth, now glimmered with unshed tears and raw hurt. "I trusted you with my heart," he murmured, the words heavy with sorrow. "I agreed to this challenge thinking it was just a test. But now I see that every moment we shared, every genuine connection, was undermined by the truth that it was all a wager." His voice faltered as he struggled to maintain composure, his gaze never leaving Isabella's, searching for an explanation that could mend the breach between them. In the silence that followed, the truth hung in the air like a palpable barrier. The revelation was not merely a public scandal. It was an exposure of Isabella's inner contradictions, a collision between her cold, calculated world and the raw, unpredictable reality of genuine emotion. For the first time, she was forced to confront the possibility that in her relentless pursuit of control, she had unwittingly sacrificed the authenticity of her own heart. As the visitor quietly left and the door clicked shut behind him, Isabella felt the enormity of her choices bearing down on her. The truth was now a tangible weight, a reminder that in trying to dominate fate, she had risked losing something far more precious. In the fading glow of the evening light, Isabella realized that she stood at a crossroads. One path led back to a life of controlled perfection, while the other beckoned toward a future defined by vulnerability, redemption, and the uncertain promise of love. In the days that followed the explosive revelation, the atmosphere in Isabella's penthouse turned frigid, a stark contrast to the warm connection that had once glimmered between her and James. The once familiar cadence of their shared moments was now punctuated by silence and bitterness. The revelation of the bet had not only exposed a secret, but had also fractured the fragile trust they had built together. For James, the betrayal cut deep. For Isabella, regret and determination warred within her. James's daily routine, once marked by his steady, unyielding resolve, began to unravel. He retreated into a world of long, solitary walks through the city's quieter neighborhoods, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. The man who had once greeted each day with a quiet smile now wore a mask of sorrow and disillusionment. He spent long hours in the shelter, tending to those who needed him, perhaps hoping that in the earnest faces of the people he cared for, he might find some semblance of solace and clarity. One bleak afternoon, as rain pelted the windows of the penthouse, James finally reached his breaking point. In a voice laden with both determination and despair, he declared that he could no longer remain in a marriage built on deception. "I might not come from your world," he said, his tone trembling with raw emotion, "but I'm not a chess piece for you to move around at your whim." His words echoed in the silent room, a final repudiation of the arrangement that had once promised challenge but now delivered only heartbreak. Isabella watched, her heart shattering with each word, as James methodically packed a few belongings into a worn leather bag. Every measured movement, every quiet sigh of resignation, was a testament to the deep emotional toll of the bet. The space between them, once filled with tentative hope and growing intimacy, now became a chasm too wide to bridge. In the midst of the storm of his emotions, James's eyes met hers one last time, a look that mingled sorrow, anger, and a desperate plea for honesty. For Isabella, the moment was a reckoning. She had orchestrated this elaborate wager with the cold precision of a business transaction, convinced that control was the only path to success. Now, as James turned his back and walked out the door into the drenching rain, the full weight of her choices bore down on her. The luxurious penthouse, once a sanctuary of order and opulence, now felt like a prison built from the ruins of her pride. In the ensuing days, silence reigned in the spaces they had once shared. Isabella tried to reach out, to call, to write, to explain, but every attempt was met with an impenetrable wall of hurt and betrayal. The echoes of James's departure reverberated through every corner of her life, forcing her to confront the bitter truth. Winning the bet meant nothing if it cost her the only thing that had truly mattered. As the rain subsided and a cold winter wind swept through the city, Isabella was left alone with her shattered illusions and the painful clarity of regret. The relentless pursuit of control had led her to this moment of profound loss, a moment where the promise of power was eclipsed by the void of a broken heart. And in that desolate silence, Isabella understood that the price of her ambition had been far higher than she could ever have imagined. In the weeks following James's departure, the glittering world that Isabella had once ruled with such relentless precision began to crumble around her. Business deals, galas, and the unending stream of accolades lost their luster, replaced by an overwhelming emptiness that no amount of wealth or power could fill. Every corner of her penthouse now whispered the painful memory of James's absence, a constant reminder of the profound cost of her relentless pursuit of control. Isabella found herself wandering the familiar corridors of her life in a state of quiet despair. The meticulously organized schedules, the carefully planned events, and even the luxurious solitude of her apartment now seemed like relics of a world she no longer belonged to. In her heart, the truth that had been so long buried, hidden beneath layers of ambition and calculated detachment, began to assert itself with painful clarity. The bet was not simply a challenge to her ability to adapt. It had become a mirror, reflecting the hollowness of a life built solely on control. Driven by a desperate need to reclaim a sense of purpose, Isabella began frequenting the homeless shelter once more. Initially, her visits were tentative, an attempt to recapture the fleeting moments of authenticity she had experienced before the betrayal came to light. But as days turned into weeks, the shelter transformed from a place of forced charity into a refuge where she could confront her inner demons. The stark reality of life at the shelter, with its unfiltered struggles and unadorned moments of kindness, forced her to face the truth about herself. Working side by side with volunteers, Isabella learned to set aside her polished persona. She rolled up her sleeves, served meals, and listened with genuine compassion to the stories of those who had nothing to lose. In the unassuming kitchen of the shelter, as she stirred a pot of soup and exchanged quiet words with the people who called this place home, Isabella began to rediscover a part of herself that had long been buried under the weight of perfection. The laughter of a child, the grateful smile of a weary parent, and the unpretentious camaraderie of the volunteers reminded her that true strength lay not in control, but in vulnerability and empathy. The transformation was not instantaneous, but gradually, the rigid structures of her former life gave way to a new understanding, a recognition that real power was found in the willingness to let go and to embrace imperfection. With every act of kindness, every shared moment of sorrow and hope, Isabella's heart softened, and the remnants of her old self began to dissolve. The penthouse, once a fortress of cold luxury, now seemed distant and irrelevant compared to the warmth and authenticity of human connection. As Isabella sat in a quiet corner of the shelter one late afternoon, reflecting on the days that had passed since James left, she finally acknowledged the bitter truth. The bet had never been about winning or losing a challenge. It had been a catalyst, a painful, unyielding force that forced her to confront the emptiness of a life lived solely for control. In the gentle murmur of gratitude around her, she recognized that in letting go, she might just find the redemption that had long eluded her. For the first time in years, Isabella embraced the notion that vulnerability was not a weakness but a doorway to a more meaningful existence. And as she wiped away a tear that glistened in the fading light, she silently vowed to rebuild her life, this time on the foundation of compassion, authenticity, and the hard-won lessons of loss. Determination replaced despair in the weeks following her awakening. With newfound clarity and a heart that had been softened by genuine compassion, Isabella resolved to bridge the chasm that had formed between her and James. The memory of his departure haunted her every thought, a constant reminder that the cost of her relentless pursuit of control had been the very essence of what she now longed to reclaim. It was time, she decided, to make amends. One brisk morning, Isabella set out for the shelter with a purpose that filled her with a tentative hope. The chill in the air did little to dampen the fire burning within her, a burning desire to show James that the transformation within her was real. As she stepped through the familiar doors of the shelter, the warmth of genuine smiles and heartfelt greetings enveloped her like a comforting embrace. Every person there, whose life she had come to know so intimately, silently encouraged her in her quest for redemption. After spending the day assisting with daily tasks and reconnecting with those whose lives had intertwined with her own during her journey of change, Isabella finally gathered the courage to confront the man who had once meant everything to her. In a quiet corner of the shelter, away from prying eyes, she found James engrossed in his work, a quiet strength evident even in his solitary focus. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was charged with years of unspoken regret and tentative hope. Breaking the silence, Isabella's voice trembled with sincerity as she said, "James, I've been wrong. Not about the bet, but about what truly matters. I let my need for control blind me to the beauty of a life built on real connections." Her eyes searched his, pleading for understanding. Reaching into her bag, she produced a legal document, a deed transferring ownership of one of her properties to the shelter. "This is my first step towards making amends," she continued softly. "I want to give something back that goes beyond any wager, a chance to create something lasting, something meaningful. I care about you, James, not as part of a bet, but because you've shown me what it means to be truly alive." For a long, charged moment, James studied her face, the face of a woman transformed by hardship, regret, and ultimately, redemption. The hurt and betrayal that had once darkened his eyes began to soften into something akin to cautious hope. "I never imagined you'd come to see it that way," he murmured, his voice a fragile mixture of surprise and vulnerability. "I don't know if I can ever forget what happened, but perhaps, maybe we can start anew." His words, tentative yet sincere, hung in the air like the promise of a long-awaited spring after a harsh winter. In that quiet moment, as the shelter bustled with the quiet energy of lives being rebuilt, Isabella and James found themselves standing on the precipice of a new beginning. The past, the bet, the deceptions, and the ensuing pain would always be a part of their shared history. But in that fragile, yet real, exchange of forgiveness and determination, they discovered the possibility of a future defined not by control or manipulation, but by genuine connection and mutual growth. As the day gave way to a soft, golden dusk, Isabella realized that her journey had come full circle. The woman who had once built her life on the pillars of perfection and wealth had finally learned that true strength lay in vulnerability and compassion. With the legal document now a symbol of her commitment to change, she stepped closer to James, silently inviting him to join her in forging a path that honored the lessons of the past, while embracing the uncertain promise of tomorrow. In that moment, amid the gentle hum of life at the shelter and the quiet murmur of hope, Isabella and James took their first steps together toward a future where second chances were not just possible, but transformative. And that, my friends, is the story of how one bet changed everything. A journey of love, loss, and redemption, where control meant nothing and true connection meant everything. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the twists, the emotions, and the unforgettable moments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let me know your thoughts. Would you have made the same choices as Isabella and James? Your support means the world, and I can't wait to share more incredible stories with you. See you in the next one.